So today we're going to be talking about topic 5.3, classification. So before we get going, I want you to take a moment and think to yourself, what do you know about classifying different types of organisms? Why is it important to classify organisms? So kind of think back, why would we need to all have a similar way to communicate? So here we go, 5.3 classification. So before we get into classification, kind of looking at this diversity of life question. Why are organisms different from one another? So we're always trying to classify them, to group them together, to categorize them, but we do have differences. And if you think back to topic 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3, we talked about chromosomes and DNA and the differences of different traits on genes. So because organisms have genes or DNA, there's possibility of mutations as well as sexual reproduction that creates a unique alleles on each chromosome. So even species that reproduce asexually can have mutations and become unique from their original species. So we do have a wide diversity of life, and since organisms are very different, it's hard to categorize them because there are some differences that are very unique, but the things that are the same can also be grouped together. So we use these commonalities and these differences in order to classify organisms' diversity. So there's a couple systems that you're going to learn about how we kind of organize them visually for people. There's cladograms, which we'll get to in a bit, and there's also dichotomous keys. This is a fun little dichotomous key. For example, what kind of pet is right for you? So you would start here at the top, and you would work down. It's like a choose your own adventure, where it says, do you want a pet to love and care for? No? Then come on down and follow this arrow, and you should get a rock. Do you want a pet to love and care for? Yes? Then start following the next path. Are you likely to forget about your pet? Yes? Then maybe if you think you'd forget about him for weeks at a time, then you should probably still go with the rock. If you think you'll forget about him, yes, but for days at a time, maybe go with a fish. If no, you don't think you'll ever forget about your pet, then it's, do you want a creature that returns your affection? Yes. Do you want to train your pet to do things? Yes. How do you want your pet to think? How do you want your pet to think of you? Master, get a dog. Slave, get a cat. And you can work your way over here to figure out how to get a giraffe. If you want, you can pause it. But you can see how it's a yes or no situation. And this is what we kind of do with different characteristics of organisms. And we like to say yes if they have it and no if they don't. And this helps us start to sort out which kingdom or phylum they fall into. So before we talk about classifying it, let's get to the most specific end actually of our classification system. It's being a species. So a species is the most individualistic state you can be in as a group of organisms genetically. And it says, when we use the definition for a species, this is the more common one: a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. So usually it's pretty key that there can be some way to exchange genes. For example, like with the bacteria that we learned about in the evolution gizmo, that bacteria can exchange genes through conjunction, or through breeding or interbreeding within your population for sexual reproduction. And usually we would tack on that the offspring also needs to be able to be fertile as well. But all scientists don't agree on the definition for species, so sometimes this can get a little confusing and it can mess up our classifying of organisms. So sometimes they'll say, well, it's an ecological species, which would be a set of organisms adapted to a particular set of resources in an environment, like they have the same niche. Or it could be a genetic species, meaning they have similarities in their DNA. Or an evolutionary species, where they share a similar ancestor because of maybe homologous structures. Or a breeding species, which is two organisms that are able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. This last one is usually the one we use or we talk about, but all four of these technically we could combine them together and maybe make a better definition for a species to include multiple organisms or multiple types of domains. So for example, lions and tigers. Okay. Evolutionarily, they're separated from one another for about 3.7 million years. Okay. So that means they divided away from each other 3.7 million years ago. They can interbreed, so that would make them kind of be a breeding species, but when they do interbreed, it's usually because they're in captivity and kind of in a forced situation. And so this would be very unique because in the wild, they would never want to interbreed. Lions are usually found in grassland and they're cooperative hunters, where tigers are usually found in woodlands with trees and they're individual hunters. These are two pictures you can see of a mix. So a liger is a male lion that was bred with a female tiger. And a tagalong is a male tiger that was bred with a female lion. So there's also two different names, but they usually don't have fertile offspring, so they often don't get considered a species because of that. And they wouldn't happen naturally. Two things to think about. What about two populations of species which could potentially interbreed but do not because they are living in different niches or separated by long distances? So like they are now two different species because they often don't interbreed and they've become so genetically different, or their allele frequencies are very different. But are they the same species still? Or what about species that do not interbreed because they reproduce asexually, like I talked about earlier, like bacteria or clonal plants? So, and with that said, how many species are there on Earth? In 2011, the number 8.7 million was given, but they were only focusing on eukaryotic species, which is leaving out different bacteria and microorganisms, like prokaryotes. But also recently, in 2019, the number 1 trillion has come up. So, and they are including microorganisms and using DNA databases to try to figure those, because you can only usually classify bacteria by looking at their DNA sequences. So somewhere between 8.7 million and 1 trillion is how many species are on Earth at this moment. So let's get into how we're going to classify all those species. And the way we do it is through the process of taxonomy. So taxonomy is a practice in science of hierarchy classification. So trying to take it from, like, if you look at the umbrella idea, right, we have this main overarching concept or theme, and it dwindles down and gets more specific as you get to the bottom of the stick that you're holding to hold up the umbrella, to more specific features. So the purpose of classification, like why would we do this? If you're thinking about it from an international mindedness perspective, universal language for scientists who speak different languages in different countries, all have a common way to catalog or record what species they have discovered. So we don't start naming things, the common names, which we still do this. We name things different names for our areas culturally because of our experience with them, but they still all have the same scientific name in the taxonomy system. So for example, the blue crab, which is over here, you'll notice the genus, this name in the front, Calonectis, is the same for all of these species of crabs. So we have the blue crab, which is the common name, but here is its scientific name. So the genus, Calonectis sapidus. The lesser blue crab, also the same genus, because it's a crab, Calonectis, but its species name is Similis. The red blue crab, Calonectis bocoruti, the ornate blue crab, Calonectis orontis, and the blue land crab. Notice the genus is now different. So Cardosoma guanhumi. This one is going to be less related to all of these other four. But notice, first of all, the naming system, the scientific name, which is always difficult for us, and it seems probably like we should just skip it, but this is what is cataloged in large worldwide databases. So it's important that we do that, because otherwise we get lost in all of these common names. So for example, the Mugelcephalus is found all over the world and has a variety of common names depending on where you live. So some people call it the striped mullet, the black mullet, the sea mullet, the flathead mullet, and the gray mullet. So kind of picture if you went to a sushi location in a different country and we were calling tuna apple tree. way off, but you wouldn't know that they're talking about tuna. They call it an apple tree, but it's a tuna. So the scientific naming system, taxonomy, helps us not only organize who's related to who, but also to create a name that we can always refer back to no matter where you are in the world. So this will help us predict characteristics shared by members of a group and show evolutionary links. So here you can see a tree that shows the three main domains, and then it breaks down into our kingdoms. So like here, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya are the domains. But then if you break into eukarya, so these would be all eukaryotic celled organisms, you can see ones you recognize like animals, plants, fungi. So those would be different kingdoms. So let's get into it more specifically. The person who invented this naming system we call, first of all, Binomial System of Nomenclature. So the binomial system is like our name, Homo sapien. That's our binomial system name. Carl Linnaeus is the person who came up with this way back in the 1700s, and we still use it today. He wrote about it in a book called System Natura in 1753. He was way ahead of his time because the system actually came out to be pretty spot on. But there were some things that were very questionable in his writing, probably because of social context in that time. So, for example, he grouped apes and human beings in the same category, which we now know today, looking at DNA and genetically, that's not true. Four groups of, but you can see where you can see similarities, and you can see why sometimes body features and movements and function can confuse us and group things together, like anything that flies. Should it be grouped together? He also had 4 human groups, so there was the inherited biological but also cultural characteristics, he said. So Homo European are light-skinned, blonde, and they're governed by laws, where Homo American was copper-colored and was regulated by customs. Homo Asiatic was sooty and dark-eyed and governed by opinions, and Homo African was black and indolent and governed by impulse. So, based on our 21st standards, Linnaeus was definitely a racist, but at that time, during the social context that were occurring there, it wasn't looked at as so, and not really thought as disgusting that you would put that type of grouping of people together. But in general, his system has been pretty spot on for how we can classify successfully species and internationally stay connected that way. So when we look at the binomial system of nomenclature, the ones you always see is the genus and then the species. So a species, remember, is a group of organisms with similar characteristics which can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. We're going to go with that as our main definition for species, even though I just said there's other ones that we argue about. The genus is your principal taxonomic category that ranks above the species, but also falls below the family. So if you are in the same genus as another species, that means you must have more common DNA than someone who's in a different genus. So, but if you're a species, right, if you're a separate species, then you're unique from another species. But if you're in the same genus, that means you must have had a common ancestor. So binomial nomenclature, and I will say this in your quiz or test, what is the binomial nomenclature for this? The first name is always the genus, and it's written in italics if it's typed, or underlined if you do it by hand. Okay, so the first letter is also always in uppercase. The second name is always the species, and it's written in italics if in type, or it's underlined if not, and all letters are in lowercase. So you can see here this is typed. So Homo with the H is capitalized, is the genus, and then sapiens is our species name as humans, and notice it's all lowercase. So Homo sapiens, the genus and species name together, and that is our binomial nomenclature for our name in the scientific community. So when we talk about classifying organisms, we always start with their domains. So the 3 domains, and this has changed a couple times, so in 1990 is the last time it's changed. So our 3 domains, and this is the biggest umbrella group you can have, is bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Eukarya are all eukaryotic cells, and archaea and bacteria are all prokaryotic cells. Once you get into the eukaryotes, we need to be broken down further into kingdoms. But we'll get to that. But previously, the domains used to be these kingdoms, but it's no longer this. So if you're ever looking at a book and you see this, it first starts with domains, and then we break it into a different set of kingdoms. So notice these prokaryotes are technically out of kingdoms now, and protocystas are out of kingdoms now. So when we look at the three kingdoms, we have the Archaea prokaryotes domain, which is basically extreme ancient bacteria that still live today, but they can handle things when the Earth's atmosphere and environment was very different. So extremely hot springs, for example, or extremely toxic or acidic pHs, or very high salt concentrations. So these are two species here. For example, the sulfobus species grow in volcanic springs with optimal growth occurring at a pH of 2 to 3 and temperatures of 75 to 80 degrees Celsius. So they can handle extremely hot temperatures in very acidic environments. They usually have no nuclear membrane because they're prokaryotes. They don't have membrane-bound organelles, and their RNA and biochemistry is distinct from bacteria. Bacteria, regular bacteria, and we call them eubacteria, have no nuclear membrane, so they're still considered prokaryotes because they have no membrane-bound organelles. One example could be Staphylococcus aureus, which is the one above, and this can cause skin infections and respiratory disease. Eukaryota, which is what we are a part of, includes several kingdoms, including fungi, animals, and plants, and examples range from algae all the way to humans. And we have nuclear membranes where our DNA is stored. So we have membrane-bound organelles, and that's what makes us everything in this category is going to be a eukaryote. Now you might be wondering where viruses are classified. Viruses are considered not living because they have to use a host in order to survive. So they're not classified as living organisms in the same way that eukaryotes, archaeans, and bacteria are, but they are considerably important in the biological community, and especially as we're looking into them more with the COVID pandemic, we're seeing and understanding their DNA and RNA factors better and how they survive and spread. So some different ways you can look at the 7 levels in the hierarchy or taxa is like this. So think of domain as the biggest one, so the one which was the eubacteria and archaea bacteria and eukaryotes or eukarya. So the domain, then it goes to the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and the species. And sometimes there's even a subspecies. Like right now for Homo sapiens, they actually say we're Homo sapiens sapien. So our subspecies name is also sapien. This would be for us here. So you can see our full binomial nomenclature. So we have our kingdom is Animalia. We're in the Eukarya domain. Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Homininae, genus Homo, species H. sapien. So there's our genus name. And then our subspecies species name is Homo sapiens sapiens. If you've already written the full name out somewhere in writing, usually you can start shortening the genus names and just leave the final species name written all the way out. This is another way to look at it. It's like a funnel, right? So if you're a species, some of your DNA is going to be similar to your genus. And if you're in that genus, some of your DNA is going to be similar to the family you're in. If you're in the same family, some of your DNA is similar to the same order, and so forth, all the way down to your domain. And this is all of life here, because all 3 domains go into this. So think of it as species is the most specific, where domain is the most broad. You are going to have to, on the test, be able to remember one plant and one animal fully all the way through. So knowing its domain all the way down to its species name. So one way you can remember the order is this little acronym here, does Kennard play classical or folk guitar songs. So you can see how it to help you remember this one. So does Kennard play classical or folk guitar songs? And here you can see this is the full scientific nomenclature for human, and this one's for a meadow buttercup. So maybe take some time, try to find your favorite flower and your favorite animal. Maybe you just want to know the human one because you are a human, to memorize it. So let's look at how we actually classify these organisms. So in here it says, which two species of reef sharks are most closely related? So if you look here at their binomial nomenclature name, you should be able to tell who's most related to who. So take a moment to think about it. Yep, I hope you guessed correct. These two on the ends, the green ones, are more related because they have the same genus name, where this species here had a different one. So these two are more related to each other. What about here? Which two are most closely related? Take a moment, think about it. And hopefully you got it correct. You'll notice that these two are more related because they have the same genus name, Canis lupus, in front of it, though they are different species. And these two, this one has a different genus from these two, so it must be, it's not as related to the Canis lupus. What about this question? It says, which of the following are true about these elephants? So you can see their names here, their genus name and species name. And here are the options down here. So hopefully you were able to figure out that the answer is C, which is 2 and 3 only. These are two species in different genus, or genus, and because they don't have the same name, and they are from two genii in the same family. So they must, they're elephants, for crying out loud, so they look very similar. So their family name, which is going to come before their genus, is the same, but their genus is different. So you can try to do the same here with the most familiar organisms in the Chordata phyla. So now remember, it goes domain, kingdom, phyla. Okay, does Kennard play? So phyla. So from the phylum or phyla, can be said either way, belongs the subphylum Vertebrata. So we have vertebrae, we have a spine. Okay, so can you match the different classes with the images? So these are class names here. So our phylum is Chordata, right? So take a moment and see and guess, pause this if you want, and try to guess which of these organisms goes with which of these. So take a pause. Okay, hopefully you were able to figure this out. Usually the two that students get most confused are reptiles and amphibians. So let's look at their differences. So when we sum up the vertebrae class of the Chordata phyla, we usually look at, in a dichotomous key, this is what would split organisms up. Their limb types, so for example, 4 pendactyl limbs versus fins down here. 4 pendactyl limbs, 2 limbs modified as wings, so you can see it has to do with the limbs. The gas exchange system, so how they breathe, what are their lungs like, how they reproduce, and then the other features, and this is usually what's going to really separate them further down the line. But you can see here for the class mammals, this is where we fall. And this is what makes us unique from these other species. But for the difference between reptiles and amphibians, usually a good reminder is their skin, right? So amphibians have soft, moist, permeable skin, like this frog here. And reptiles usually have dry scales, like the iguanas outside. Impermeable skin, simple teeth. And then also sometimes how they reproduce. So reptiles reproduce internally, and they have soft shells that they lay. And amphibians usually release their eggs in water, and they are reproduced there. So their eggs and sperm are released in water, and they find each other. Kingdom Plantae. So when you look at the kingdom Plantae here, you can see it's grouped into 2 spots, vascular plants and non-vascular plants. So this is really important. This is usually a key thing that you're going to have to remember, and I know it seems specific, but This is how we would group plants and separate them right away. So a vascular system, and here's the definition down here, is a transport system, which includes the xylem and phylum, which is going to transport water up to the leaves, like the trunk. The xylem and phylum would be in there, and it's going to transport different nutrients and water all the way up to the leaves of the plant. Where these two over here do not have those systems. So like mosses, which are called Birophyta, and the Chlorophyta is going to be like algae. These do not have vascular systems. So when we group them, when we try to remember the differences here, or in a dichotomous key, the characteristics that tell them apart are their leaves, roots, and stem systems. So for example, coniferous trees or pine trees, you can see the leaves are usually narrow with a thick waxy cuticle, where a flowering plant, stems may be woody, shrubs and trees, leaves and roots variable in structure. So pine trees you can usually recognize right away, right by their leaves. Vascular tissue, which we talked about already. So what you basically need to remember is birophytes do not have them, and everybody else does, except the Chlorophyta. And then their reproductive structure. So some use spores and some use seeds. So here's the kingdom Plantae. We get broken up into different phyla and classes. And so you can see here how they're broken up into. These are the different phylas here for animals. So vertebrates and then invertebrates are here. So these ones will be the trickiest because you don't have very much interaction with them, but the vertebrae phylas were these ones right here. Okay. So let's go and look at these tricky ones. So take a moment, pause, and see if you can put these different phyla names with these images and see if you can figure it out. Okay, I bet you couldn't figure it out. Let's try to get you to use this key in order to figure one out. So this is called a dichotomous key, and it's just like that choose your own pet in visual that I gave you in the beginning. So you can see that a dichotomous key helps you identify the 6 main phyla of invertebrate here. The first question, the first yes or no is it symmetrical? So when we talk about symmetry, we're talking about radial symmetry. Is it circular and perfectly even? Bilateral symmetry, where you could divide it evenly in half, or no symmetry, it doesn't have shape. So if it does, you would go on to question 2. If it doesn't, you would know that it's Phylum Porifera. Okay? So for example, if we jump back here, so this is Porifera. If you look at these, you would say, which one doesn't have symmetry? It's actually this one right here. I know it doesn't seem like it, but if you look, it's not perfectly even. There's a piece that even comes off over here, and it's kind of random in shape. If it were to grow, it could actually grow further out. So that species is actually going to be the Phylum Porifera. So let's pick another one, like this, for example. We could say, does it have symmetry? Yes, I could probably divide that evenly in half. Is it then I go on to question 2. So here's question 2. What type of symmetry is it? Radial or bilateral? It's not circular. I'm thinking it's more we could divide it in half long ways. So bilateral, go to question 3. Does it have a gastric tube? You probably won't know this, but take a guess. I know that that type of worm does, so mouth and anus. Some species don't have an anus, by the way, so they eat and throw up their waste through their mouth. So it does have a mouth and anus. Go to question 4. How is it segmented? So this is the 2 pictures for segmentation. So does it have, does it seem like it's built together by pieces? Or is it have no segments at all and it's one long shot? I would say this worm looks like it's in little segments there. And so I'm going to go on to question 5 because it was yes. And the exoskeleton. An exoskeleton would be like, does it have a hard outer shell? No, so that's going to be Phylum Annelida. So try and do this for yourself. You can go back and forth or stop the video and go back and forth and try to do it. When you're done, we're going to move on and there'll be the answers. So go ahead and pause right now. Okay, I'm guessing you're done at this point. This would be the answers here. So you can see for each of them what they are. Now you might be like, that's crazy, I have to memorize this, but actually they more want you to know how to use a dichotomous key in order to find the traits when it comes to these different phyla, because we know they are difficult to remember, but you need to be comfortable with the differences between plants as well as animals. Okay, so if you look here, you can see that this phyla that we were just looking at, we look at symmetry, segmentation, digestive tract, and some other features, and that's how we classify them and separate them. This is a cladogram right here that I told you about earlier, and you can see how it works. If you are on this side, you are less related to this side, for example. Or we could look at it this way, the lion and the jaguar are more related than the leopard, because the leopard is over here in its own piece. But these three are more related than to this side, right here, the tiger and the snow leopard. So in natural classification, the genus and the accompanying higher taxa consist of all the species that have evolved from one common ancestral species. So this is like a natural classification system, and it is expected that members of a group are going to share important attributes or homologous traits. So traits that have the same structure, they might have different functions, but if they have the same structure or bones in the same locations, we know that they must have similar DNA to some extent that was inherited from a common ancestor. So grouping together birds, bats, and bees because they fly would be an artificial classification system, as they do not share common ancestors and they evolve the ability to fly independently. So if you looked at their bone structures, they would not be the same, meaning they don't have similar DNA. They just have the same features, which we call analogous structures. Plants and fungi were once classified together because they both possessed and shared characteristics such as shell walls, but it is now known that this is an artificial grouping, as the cell walls have different molecular biology and they evolve separately. So natural classification is not as straightforward as convergent evolution can make distantly related organisms appear more similar. Convergent means they start to converge and look alike, but their DNA is different. And adaptive radiation can make similar organisms start to look very different because they've had a change in their environments and they've start to use whatever traits they have in different niches, and they start to look different or their functions are different, and they start to diverge away from each other. So classifying can be pretty difficult. It's always changing. Scientists can regroup an organism or a species that was misplaced. So it's not always a perfect science, but they're just trying to make sense of who's related to who and also have an international way of communicating with scientists around the world. All right, so what you're going to do now is you're going to go to the class phylum notes, and you're going to choose one of the phylas, and you're going to use your book to, so for example, you might pick Birophyta, and you're going to fill in the chart about their common characteristics and how they're different from other phylas. So please use your books. You can also use online, but I highly recommend your book because there are a page that would really just give it to you, or you can refer back to parts in this lecture that had tables already. So please pick a phyla, put your name on the top of that phyla on the class table, and you all have rights to edit it, so you'll all be filling it in together. All right, have a good rest of your day. Please put these lecture notes in Manage Back, and let me know if you have any questions at the beginning of next class about this topic. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.